This is Duke University.
Professor Walker is the Professor of Social Policy at the University of Oxford. His book, The Shame of Poverty, which is just out, is a 2-year investigation of the consequences of shame in impoverished communities of 7 diverse locations: rural Uganda, Norway, United Kingdom, urban China, Pakistan, and Korea. His work argues that shame and poverty are inextricable, and that this has lasting effects on both the duration and the prevalence of poverty. This is aggravated, not surprisingly, by social policies that buy into the idea of shame and stigmatize, in turn, the recipients of social protection. These phenomena, although he doesn't talk about them in this study, are observed throughout the United States and very much an issue here in Durham and throughout North Carolina. In a recent paper, Poverty in a Global Perspective, Is Shame a Common Denominator? Walker claims that although the shame of poverty is culturally nuanced throughout the world, that each population he studied exhibited elements of despair, depression, lack of personal efficacy attributed to poverty. Globally, this was compounded by the shame imposed by those not living in poverty, often in the form of public discourse and in anti-poverty policy. Now, Walker's work on the pathology surrounding poverty and how shame contributes to the perpetuation of policy has really important implications for those who study the history of poverty and also of poverty policy. His work shows that the pain and the difficulties surrounding poverty extend far beyond material hardship. He calls this a key global challenge and advocates a new response to poverty based on global human rights legislation. We're lucky to have Robert Walker here for our 99% project. And his talk tonight is entitled, Do We Accept the Right to Be Extremely Poor? Results from an Empirical Inquiry. So please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Walker.
Thank you, Robert, for that very warm welcome. Thank you, too, for coming to spend an evening in this darkened room when you could be celebrating the sunset outside. I'm deeply appreciative. I'm also very privileged to be here. It is, after all, Duke. More privileged that you chose me among my many collaborators. Whether that was a wise choice, we will determine over the next 50 minutes or so, I guess. On the other hand, standing here in front of a room full of scholars who've grappled with the concept of human rights, when I've only dabbled, is deeply intimidating. And it may well be that I've actually drawn the short straw. I was asked to come up with a provocative title. Spontaneously, I said, why not? Do we accept the right to be extremely poor? It's a question mark, which is a bit unfortunate, because it means I have to answer it. And I guess my answer, based on simple arithmetic, is going to be yes. Yes, we do accept the right to be extremely poor. And my reasoning, I need this thing. My reasoning is on the next slide. Let's hope it works. It does. The answer is here. In the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York. It's got nothing to do with that modest, unpretentious building that fits so wonderfully into the local neighbourhood. No, it's inside. At least it was in February when I visited it. The second, or maybe it was the third floor, had been totally emptied of any visual arts. The walls had been painted, a very large room, about this sort of size. And in the centre was a set of paints and spray paints, and visitors were encouraged to cover that room with graffiti. And they did. One person took it upon themselves to get a stepladder, and they must have clambered up at least 12 feet. And that ladder precariously balanced. They wrote these words. Person who will never be forgotten for the initials of CA. No such thing as luck, only opportunity created by hard work. There, I guess, is the American dream. We can all be president if we get off our backsides and do something. Thereby hangs conceptualised the notion of the work ethic. That is the story that I'm going to tell. Those of you who feel that slumber for the next 50 minutes is worthwhile, you won't miss anything. The argument rests upon that statement. Somebody who has no conception of the lottery of birth, who would not play with the ideas that poverty, any poverty, could be structural in its origin. No, it's a matter of personal responsibility. Those of you who are suffering from insomnia can stay with me, and this is the journey that I hope together we will take. I want to begin by reminding you very briefly about some of the things we know about global poverty. Then again to remind you things that we know about human rights and extreme poverty, the juxtaposition, conjunction of those two things. That you know. I want to move on next to looking at the distance between those aspirations which come from human rights thinking and what we've achieved as nation states in terms of the policies that we put in place. And then to try and begin to understand the nature of that gap and what underpins it. And then I want to sort of conclude by going back to the question that David Farrow asked me when I was interrogated CIA style for that set of questions and answers that appeared on your website. Should we give up, was essentially his question. Why don't we? And I wanted to finish by seeking to address that really hard and challenging issue. But before then, I want to talk very briefly about the empirical basis of the work that I've been doing. And it begins by having nothing whatsoever to do with human rights. Human rights has become the end of the journey rather than the start. It began with the assertion of Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize-winning economist, very important in terms of global thinking about poverty, who argued that the ability to go without shame lies at the irreducible absolutist core in the construction of poverty. God, he's a scholar, isn't he? Totally unintelligible. I think essentially what he's saying is wherever you find poverty, you also find shame. As an economist, that's a general statement applicable everywhere. Is it? That was the question we sought to address. But we also noted en route that John Rawls, philosopher, also thinks about these sorts of issues. Self-respect, he says, is perhaps the most important primary good on which a theory of justice as fairness has to concentrate. So underpinning his approach to the concept of justice is this notion of self-respect. And then to return to Amartya Sen, thinking about the nature of poverty, the poverty line, the level at which people can not only meet nutritional requirements, etc., but also achieve adequate participation in communal activities and be free from the public shame from failure to satisfy social conventions. So we've moved from a concept of poverty which is about lack of resources, lack of income, to a concept of poverty that is essentially multidimensional. Not only have we got a lack of income, but we may have a lack of material resources, material deprivation that follows from that, but also the psychosocial consequences of that lack of resources and that material deprivation. Poverty is multidimensional. It's experienced by people in poverty as all of those dimensions at once. As a social scientist, we might think in separating those dimensions out and scoring an individual along each of those dimensions and locating them in some sort of multidimensional space according to the addition of those scores. That's our way of trying to understand what it feels like. But those dimensions of poverty experience now could well become causes of poverty in future, leading to the perpetuation of poverty. And maybe shame is one of the vectors that leads to poverty now becoming poverty of the future. And certainly if you read social psychology, you can begin to tell a story which follows something like this. That poverty leads to shame, and that shame brings with it a feeling of lack of confidence, of limited self-worth, which reduces one's ability to do the things that would benefit one, a reduction in individual agency, which logically might prevent an individual from helping themselves to move out of the circumstances in which they find themselves. We know that if you're experiencing shame, it's painful, that you want to avoid situations where pain is likely to occur. So we withdraw socially from those situations where you're likely to be ashamed. That social exclusion feeds into the notion of limited self-worth. It also reduces social capital, the resources that you can draw upon to help you in times of need, which logically, again, might feed what you might see as some sort of cycle. Poverty is felt as pain, as psychic pain, like a scar which refuses to heal. And one of the reasons it refuses to heal is that shame is not only felt internally, but imposed externally from outside. You and I, in the way we think about poverty, discuss poverty, interact with people who are themselves living in poverty, are part of the shaming process. And so too, arguably, is the role that policy plays in stigmatizing people, adding to the shame, and arguably, therefore, reducing their personal agency and reducing the effectiveness of the policies that we put in place. That's the causal story that we wanted to investigate in undertaking this research. And the way we did it was to say, well, Sen says it's universal, everywhere. There's no way that as a researcher with limited resources we can ever establish that. But perhaps if we look at very different places, in all of those very different places, we find some conjunction between poverty and shame. At least that's supportive. And if we find situations where that's not true, then Sen is wrong. We can refute his hypothesis, even if we cannot demonstrate that it's universally true. So we chose very different societies in very different contexts, as Robert explained. But can you ask meaningful questions about shame and poverty across those different cultures? So what we had to do first of all was to establish that there were meaningfully similar concepts in each of those countries. And that took us into novels, it took us into poetry, it took us into film and drama and oral tradition. But crucially, we needed to talk to people in poverty. We talked to adults and children in a qualitative depth way. We're not talking about statistics. We're talking about listening and gaining understanding. But if it's right that that shame is imposed from the outside, we need to talk to people who are themselves not currently poor, the you and I's of this world. What do we think about poverty, and how do we define it, and how do we define the people who are in it? And finally, because I'm a social policy specialist, I'm interested in the nature of the policies that we put in place because I want to make them better. We've added this year the United States, or at least parts of New York, 2 elements where we've talked to people who are currently experiencing poverty in 3 neighbourhoods in New York, and we've spoken to people in those neighbourhoods or adjacent to those neighbourhoods. I'm going to briefly talk about the American research, but only briefly, partly because it's not yet thoroughly analysed. But what I'm going to talk about, or what I'm going to draw upon, is not the whole of this research. Otherwise, you wouldn't buy the book. You won't buy the book anyway. And what's more, it seems to be free. It's an e-book, which is a joy for you and a desperate cause of poverty for poor academics. But leave that to one side. Come back to that at a moment. So I'm going to draw upon those last two elements. I'm going to talk to you about the views of the middle class, as it were, and talk to you about policy. But as I said, I want to begin by briefly reminding you some of the things we know about poverty in a global context. Let's begin by thinking about poverty defined in absolute terms as some sort of basket of goods. And the UN has this notion of poverty being equivalent to somebody who's earning less than $1.25 a day. And we look over time and we see a fantastic story of improvement and advance. That then is East Asia and the Pacific. So in the beginnings of the 1980s, 65% of people were living at less than $1.25 a day. And now we're down to something like 10%. Amazing achievements. It is possible to change the world. Good questions about how we changed it. Here's the sort of Europe and Central Asia. Very low levels of poverty. It's defined in these terms. Slight increase, but essentially remains static over that certain time period. Same is true of Latin America and the Caribbean, higher, but running around 10 or 12% on this definition. There we find Middle East and North Africa, low, but a consistent downward trend, actually somewhat doing better than you might argue than the European countries. There we have South Asia, a downward decline, not so effective, not such much as East Asia and the Pacific, I guess, but nevertheless still a substantial improvement. And there we have Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. That green line has fallen substantially. Green line, sorry, nobody's being able to hear me. That's probably an advantage for you. So we see South Asia has fallen, but still 42% of all people in poverty live in South Asia, despite the fact that it's fallen. About a third live in Africa, and Africa, very limited change over that time period. So the pattern, the experience, the trends are different across countries. Let's move from an absolute definition of poverty to one which is relative, thinking about not a basket of goods, but income in relation to the average. And here's a definition of people in relation to something like, it hasn't got a definition, but I think it's 50% of median household income. What we find in OECD countries is that poverty is all relative. Nobody is living at least less than $1.25 a day. But those of you who are interested in the United States and thinking about poverty levels here, you just move that threshold up to $2 a day. And we have a fascinating debate going on between Shandy and Smith and Schiefer and Eden about precisely how many people are living on $2 a day. Somewhere between 5% and 1%. Remove the percentage sign and add a million. You're talking potentially between 1 and 5 million Americans are living today on less than $2 per day. So although poverty is largely relative, we can find absolute poverty too. Some suffer both absolute poverty and relative poverty. So that indicates that there are richer people in those societies, but not that many. East Asia, we have still a problem of absolute poverty, but largely it's shared too with this concept of relative. So they're living on a subsistence, but they're also poor relative to society. Most of the society is no longer poor. And so there's a growing distance between those who are and those who aren't, which is picked up in that relative concept. So poverty has generally fallen in absolute terms. Thinking about relative poverty and absolute poverty makes a distinction and a difference, and the story is not consistent around the world. The bottom line is that if you think in absolute terms, about 1.4 billion people are currently poor at the level of subsistence. And just to add, we can only be sure about that to the nearest 100 million. Our statistics are fairly ropey. Okay, human rights and extreme poverty. This is a bit where I feel most insecure, so I shall rush through and hope you don't spot the errors. if you're really kind and considerate to me, you'll come up afterwards and say, you got that wrong. Okay, let's think about the infrastructure around human rights and extreme poverty. We have what you might think of as legislation or guidance built around the International Bill of Human Rights, which, as you know, is actually a composite of lots of other things. The United States has got a rather indifferent attitude to these sorts of things, hasn't it? I won't ask which of those conventions and which of those covenants the United States has signed up to. I wouldn't want to embarrass you. But on the other hand, they are potentially really important, providing some sort of justification for addressing much more effectively the issue of poverty. Now, that legislation is to some extent monitored by the UN Commission on Human Rights. It's a body which, in some sense, begins to ask the question, how well are countries performing in relation to that guidance? And they've also set up a system which involves the appointment of a special rapporteur who has responsibility to think very clearly and very hard about human rights on the one hand and extreme poverty on the other. That rapporteur produced a set of guiding principles in 2012, which I'm going to constantly refer back to. In some senses, I think, a remarkable achievement. And the United Nations General Assembly resolution on extreme poverty in 2013 accepted those principles, that guidance, without a vote. Probably a good thing it was without a vote, because I rather suspect a certain country in which we are currently sitting might have found it rather inconvenient had they been asked to ratify. Now, I know a number of you are really cynical and sceptical about the United Nations. In many ways, so am I. But then I also believe that the only way we can address some of the issues that we confront as a human race is through some form of global governance. And at the moment, I don't think we've got anything better. And therefore, I think it's up to us, and particularly to the generation of sitting listening, to make it a damn sight better. The Office on Human Rights produced a conceptual framework for poverty reduction back in 2004. It's very informative and it's very different in its thinking from the statistics that I've previously provided. It stresses issues of non-discrimination and equality. It emphasises empowerment and participation, involvement and listening. It suggests instigating some sort of international minimum standard. Think about that. That's asking for a global institution to think about putting in place some social protection floor which applies to every citizen on earth, and arguably people who aren't citizens as well. And it thinks about the mechanism by which we can reach that point. And it argues that one way is to hold governments to account. But it also says that international organisations and countries, rich countries like America and the United Kingdom, too have a responsibility for resolving these issues at a global level, which ultimately means putting your hand in your pockets and contributing some of your taxes to addressing these sorts of issues. The fact that only specialists in this room who know about human rights are aware of the implications of this, I think is a real challenge for us all, because I think to reach the point where we can actually deliver on these policies, we need to engage with the electorates globally too. And that really points to the democratic deficit that one might find within the United Nations. The human rights conception of poverty is also really instructive and potentially incredibly powerful. It talks about social and power relationships, not about income, not about material inadequacy, So it's operating in a different conceptual space from domestic debates about the nature of poverty. It talks, of course, about the indivisibility of rights, which is consistent in human rights thinking generally, that financial inadequacy is only possible if we provide political and civil rights. It acknowledges, too, the importance of dignity and respect in setting the lines at which one determines whether somebody is poor or not. Does it really bring a concept of social adequacy into the budgets of people who are poor? It thinks about dignity and respect in terms of how we deliver policy. The notion that people are poor, we've got to get resources to them somehow, anyhow, which is thinking in the World Bank, gets increasingly challenged by the notion of how you deliver policy is perhaps as important or approaching as important as what you actually deliver. And it challenges the rhetoric that we use in political debates. And finally, interesting sort of inversion as thinking has developed. The choice of the word dignity over equality. A realization that if one's thinking as equality as the basis of human rights, you can get equality by lowering standards as well as by raising them. Whereas dignity, it's much more difficult to do that. In some sense, a dignity is an absolute, and therefore it leads you to look up rather than look down. And it also, in a sense, raises or removes the possibility always to have a comparator when one is challenging legislation. Justice is something, justice measured through dignity or assessed through dignity is something we can assess by looking at a single individual, not by making comparisons. So what are the outcomes of human rights? I'm an evaluator in a way by training or by my day job. And in evaluation, one makes distinctions between policy outputs, what policy delivers, and policy outcomes, which is what policy achieves. I think this is really about policy outputs rather than outcomes. One important one is the Millennium Development Goals. It seems to me that those are largely framed by thinking that is shaped through a concept of human rights, with the goal of reducing poverty or halving it by 2015, which of course we're going to miss, but nevertheless it was a target that was in place. And as you're all aware, there's a great debate going on at the moment about what the Millennium Development Goals will be replaced by and what the new regime for the next 15 years will look like. The regime in which many of you will be working as young professionals using your insights into human rights. This is the framework which will shape your professional goals, maybe. In addition, we have the United Nations Decade for the Eradication of Poverty. How many people knew we were in the middle of a decade for the eradication of poverty? Not many. I didn't know until I had to prepare this lecture either. But there was secondly too, we have an ILO recommendation which is picking up on that notion that we need to put some sort of platform in, following from that thinking on human rights and from the Commission. And so in 2012, 185 countries signed up to the notion of putting in place a minimum level of social security or social protection, covering cash and health and education. Only one country abstained, and for once it wasn't the United States, it was Panama. And finally, as we go forward, what are those Sustainable Development Goals likely to look like? At the moment, they're talking about the eradication of extreme poverty, still measured as $1.25 a day. I'll come back to that in a moment. But to reduce by X% still to be defined. Poverty measured at national level. So we're not just talking now about subsistence. We're talking about your poverty line, and we're talking about percentages of reducing it here in the United States. The point is that whereas the Millennium Development Goals were conceived by the global north as something that the global south should do, we're moving into an era where all of us are going to be covered by the Sustainable Development Goals. They're goals that apply to us. They're goals that you as democratic citizens in this state can reflect on and vote on. And finally, this notion that we should implement appropriate social protection. We don't know yet that those will actually be included. There's real negotiations and there's a lot to fight for. And if you want a job to do, join the lobby to fight for the goals that you believe in. And then we have this UN resolution that I've mentioned, which links to the guiding principles on extreme poverty. Read this, something which your government and my government and every government has implicitly signed up to. That eradicating extreme poverty is not only a moral duty, but it's a legal obligation under existing international human rights law. Those are very proud, bold words. That's something that we can refer back to, however, because our governments have signed up to them. Extreme poverty and exclusion from society constitutes a violation of human dignity, and that urgent national and international action is therefore required. So it's not just a legal problem, it's telling us we need to do something about it. Okay, it's the UN, it's that building up in New York, it doesn't really have any meaning. Can we make it have meaning? Do you want to make meaning? I'm going to suggest you might, but your fellow citizens don't. The guiding principles, respect for the inherent dignity of those living in poverty, must inform all public policies. No policy should exacerbate poverty. Persons living in poverty have the right to be protected against the negative stigma attached to conditions around poverty. That persons living in poverty must be recognised and treated as free, autonomous agents, as people, as fellow citizens. And that the effective and meaningful participation is an affirmation of the right of every individual, including those who are currently poor. Again, a bold, ambitious, profoundly important set of rules, guidance that are meant to be shaping the way we make policy. There are, however, limitations beyond the limitations that governments might not want to do anything about it and their citizenry might not push them to. The Sustainable Development Goals are still thinking in terms of income. There's a great gap between income as a measure of poverty and those other things which are embedded in a human rights conception to do with power. There's also a problem that these regulations, this thinking, relates to the concept of extreme poverty, which can be traced back to Father Joseph Brzezinski, who was a priest in Paris, who was born into poverty and worked amongst the poor communities on the outskirts of Paris, who nevertheless was incredibly instrumental in terms of developing thinking around the Millennium Goals. If you go into the United Nations building, you will find a bust of him. If you're a Catholic, you will realise that in this journey to being made a saint, his contribution should not be underestimated. But his concept was that poverty was multidimensional, but it was also persistent. It was poverty that denied people the ability to exercise their rights, and experiencing deprivation so great as to prevent people bettering themselves without assistance. The notion that people in poverty needed help is crucial to his conceptualisation. And you will find in the guiding principles his influence on the shaping as Magdalena I can never remember her name, Sepulveda, drafted those guiding principles. That definition is very consistent with the notion of Joseph Brzezinski. The problem with that is the notion of poverty being sustained, being persistent, being intergenerational. What we know empirically is that most poverty is experienced in short spells, whether you're in a developed country or a country that's on the road to development. The notion that poverty is persistent as two groups, the rich and the poor, or at least the poor and the non-poor, is not matched by what we know about poverty dynamics. We've also got the issue of what happens if your income is $1.26 a day. Does that mean that none of this regulation applies to you? A legal interpretation at the moment is that's possibly the case. And what happens if poverty is not prolonged, which, as I've already indicated, most isn't. So there are limits to the territory, if you like, to which these guiding principles, bold and ambitious though they are, actually apply. So those are the aspirations, and in this room I thank humbly those of you who have thought about human rights and in any sense have engaged in a process of putting these in place. But I want now to focus on the gap between those aspirations and the reality. I want therefore to look at policies which don't respect inherent dignity of individuals. Policies that are effectively shaming. And I'm going to argue that you can find that shame in the framing of policy, in the structures, in the delivery. Think about the United Kingdom. 1550s was when we started to implement state legislation in relation to poverty. A consequence of a king called Henry VIII who wanted to marry yet another wife, and where the Catholic Church was in the way. So the simple expedient was to nationalise the church. Nationalising the church brought with it one problem. The church had been responsible for servicing the needs of poor people. It was now the responsibility of the state. When taxpayers, ratepayers, there was a land tax at the time, sought and thought and were encouraged to help the poor in their community, unlike the church, they only wanted to support those who were deserving. And we had the distinctions between deserving and undeserving poor. And if you go and look in the Oxford English Dictionary for the definition of deserving, you'll find it defined as in relation to the deserving poor. That division, that distinction in society has been perpetuated. In the 1920s, we talked about the dole. The dole was actually a system introduced by the Roman Empire, but we can talk about that later. In the 1980s, we began to think about poverty in genuine poverty, whatever that might be, or what's ingenuine poverty, I'm not quite sure. We then moved on with New Labour to think about dependency and responsibility, which everybody knew was code for irresponsibility. At the moment, we're talking about a something for nothing culture that we wish to eradicate by changing our benefit structure. South Korea as another example. South Korea sought to rapidly grow economically. It made economic success the prior goal of all policy. It meant that all citizens needed to contribute to the growing wealth of Korea. And therefore to be poor was to fail economically and to fail as a citizen. Poverty was not therefore a state issue, it was an individual issue, and minimal provision was provided. Policy structures. Many of you have thought about Nordic countries. Those wonderful countries over there in Europe where everything is perfect, everybody is blonde and has blue eyes, and the policies that they put in place are pristine. Norway sought to put in place a pristine policy, a policy that took people out of poverty by steps and placed them in the labour market and supported them en route. A ladder out of poverty to success, a way to return to the central notions of a Norwegian society. But those steps, that journey back into work, was determined by the social worker that you were working with or responsible to, whose decisions were discretionary. People have no understanding of how they can climb that ladder. And that ladder has become a ladder of shame. Your position tells you and others how bad you really are. Structure 2, take India. Really interesting concept there. Your route onto benefits is to join a list which is compiled every 5 years on the basis of data. That would seem to be a list of shameful people, but such is the level of corruption within India that you find on that list the names of very affluent local landowners. In fact, to get on that list indicates that you have influence, you have the ability to get on that list, typically through the use of bribes, which creates a double stigma. Not only you poor, but you have to use bribery in order to receive your benefits. In terms of delivery, we can think about aspects of getting into the system. Access. Jose Nunes, father of 2, a wife, becomes homeless in New York, goes to report to the office in the Bronx, which place you in a shelter. When you're going to that organisation called PATH, people can tell that you're walking to that office with all your bags, and they criticise you, they put you down. Even before you get to the office, people feel that they're being watched. And when you're there, it's literally like walking into prison. The kids have to take their shoes off. You have to remove your belt. You have to go through the metal detector. Even the kids do. But we're not going through prison, says Jose. We need to be strip searched. I'm with my family. I'm just trying to find a home. Lack of respect in terms of policy delivery. To get benefit in China, you have to convince the local neighbourhood that you're eligible, that you're deserving. Lots of reviews every 6 months, which may have to send you back to your place of origin. There are home visits of people who snoop around to make sure that you haven't got a television hidden somewhere. And what's more, they interview your acquaintances just to check that that television set isn't lent out on the day that the official visited. And as a final check, your name is posted on the local notice board, and people are encouraged to say, yes, this person is deserving, or no, they're not. And shame in the process of policy delivery in terms of poor provision. Uganda had aspirations to provide free and universal education, primary education, and did so. A bold move. What they didn't do was put the resources in place to support that. And consequently, the schools were flooded with children. Teachers had not the resources to respond. And what did the middle class do? They ran fast away from public education into the private sector, leaving schools as statements of shame. They're places where only the poor will find a resting place or a route to education. So what I'm indicating, and of course these are only examples and they're not universal, we can find good policies as well as bad ones, although we struggled hard to find those that really were dignity enhancing. But typically we get the policies that we want, not only in democratic societies, but too authoritarian governments need to reflect on what their populace want. So is it perhaps the case that these are the policies that we actually want to put in place? Let's think, what is it that causes poverty? Here's a percentage of people in countries thinking that poverty is due primarily to laziness. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, only 10% of people think that. By the time you get to Puerto Rico, 72% of people believe that the principal cause of poverty is laziness. Puerto Rico, look at the United States up there. So too, quite interestingly, are the Asian countries as well. So what is it? Something like 65% of Americans believe the principal cause of poverty is individual laziness. That work is a duty towards society. This cave plot where the stalagmites, the ones that go up, reflect the people agreeing, and the stalactites, the ones that go down, are disagreeing. Vast majorities see that work is a duty towards society. That people who don't work turn lazy. It's not only that the lazy don't work, it's if you're not working, you become lazy. Deeply held views which reflect that notion of no such thing as luck. He wasn't the exception, or she, who wrote that. It seems to be commonplace. When you talk to people and listen to their language, in India and Uganda, United Kingdom, the language was pretty abusive. Take Uganda. The poor breed every year like vermin. We love the poor, we help the poor, until you begin to thinking about specific groups. And lots of interesting stories about how children were bullied because they were poor and why they were bullied, which point back to prejudices amongst the adults. Causes of poverty, again, we use Uganda, India, and individualistic causes, alcohol abuse, polygamy, and all those sorts of things. Individual causes rather than structural. China and Norway, individualistic with structural overtones. Again, more debate, more discussion, more acceptance of things like economic restructuring, particularly in China, come to play. America, African American professionals we spoke to in East Harlem. Laziness, lack of initiative, a poor mindset, that's what I think is responsible for most people's conditions. There's no excuse not to do well in this country. American dream. The welfare programme, get rid of it. It was meant to be a band-aid situation during the Depression. It shouldn't still exist today. So those are poverty and its causes. Deserving and undeserving. Those countries, clear distinctions. In India and Uganda, there was much less distinction. Every poor person was undeserving. There weren't any deserving ones amongst them. Except it was beginning to get some sort of notion of that because in the case of Uganda, oil has been discovered, the argument was those who were involved in the oil industry were obviously lazy and therefore it was their cause, that's why they were poverty. They didn't take the opportunities which oil had brought them. US, we deserve it. We, the prosperous, deserve our situation. If you've done no work, if all you have done is to show your tank top with your pants around your ass, you do not deserve to be where I am. And this lovely one from a social worker. I assure you, in the worst neighbourhoods, everyone has a better phone than I do. In the worst neighbourhoods, they have better sneakers. Okay, that's pretty consistent with the stigmatising, derogatory programmes that we put in place. Maybe we get the policies we deserve. Why is that? Well, let's think about the process by which that approach is persistent. Think about the social values that you hold and that we've seen others in your society hold, and the opinions that those lead to, and that those opinions lead to the way that you behave, the way that you engage and interact. And what we find consistently is how you deal with the poor is to shame them. Think about the political system, the political ideology, the rhetoric that generates, that leads to policy, which we've also shown is stigmatising. One of the key things linking those two is the system of communication through mass media and the role that the media play in supporting or challenging these ideas. It's not the same everywhere. There are important differences in how the media interacts. In Britain, you have a situation where the media is divided into left and right. There's no distinction between opinion columns and news. In British newspapers, opinion and news go together. What you have is a competition amongst the newspapers for readership. And part of that competition is around whether we can get a government elected or bring a government down, brownie points if you can. And then politicians use the media in order to sell their ideas. And so you have a coming together of the financial interests and the political goals of getting into power. And what we know is the best way of getting elected is to appeal to the marginal voter. And what we know from our focus groups is that they don't like people in poverty very much, and they certainly don't like the taxes that are paid. And in Britain, benefits are almost code for poverty, and poverty is expressed in terms of benefits. India, slightly different. The Indian media have got a constitutional role, which is to challenge government. The government it originally challenged was my government, my colonial government that ruled imperial India for rather too long. What they got into was the role of challenging policy, and that's precisely what the media continually do. They challenge government that they're not doing enough to help the poor. But equally they sell their newspapers to those who are relatively affluent. And while they push the notion that we have to help the poor, they won't push it far enough to alienate their richer readership. And we could document that in terms of the stories that have been covered recently. And finally, China. More people read newspapers in China than any other country. There are something like 1,700 newspapers. It's actually more in India, but the readership is higher in China. Each of those newspapers, you add them up and you're reaching something like 104 million people who read a newspaper on a daily basis. Each of those newspapers is of course controlled by the state. So they carry what the state wants those newspapers to carry. And what the state wants those newspapers to carry is a recognition of what the state is doing to help people who are poor. A recognition that economic growth is going to have its casualties, but the state will catch those casualties before they fall too far. And what is more, the people who are caught are eternally grateful to the kindness of the state. And that's the discourse you find in the newspapers. So it challenges those beliefs that we saw earlier, that poverty is thought by the Chinese population to be largely attributable to laziness. The point is that Chinese are not stupid. They're exceedingly sceptical in terms of what they read. But their belief is still a commitment to the work ethic and the belief that those people who are around them are poor through individual failings. So, I return by trying to answer the question that I set and to bring the threads together. Do we accept the right to be extremely poor? No, we don't. We have international legislation in place that eradicates extreme poverty, not only as a moral issue, but as a legal obligation. But we do accept it in terms of the numbers that I've been citing. 1.4 billion people living on this crude measure of less than 1.25 a day. And I don't see many of us getting up and yelling that we want our government to solve that problem. Yes, too, we accept it because we believe generically, consistently across countries that poverty is effectively a just reward. It's what people deserve because basically they're lazy. No, we don't accept that because we want people to change. We impose shame upon them to get them to pull those pants up, get off their arse and get into work. Or is it ass in this part of the world? Whatever it is, it's get up and work. Yes, we accept this notion because there is no evidence that shaming and blaming can change behaviour that causes poverty. And anyway, any of you who do a modicum of thinking will realise that the vast majority of poverty is structural, imbalance between labour demand and labour supply, a whole series of other factors over which the individual person in poverty has precious little control. So the sum, I said, that I've reached the conclusion that the answer to my question is yes, we do, on the basis of arithmetic. Count the yeses and count the nos. We believe in the right to be extremely poor. Back to the question that David posed, however. Have we hope that we can challenge, that there is something we can do and ought to do about our fellow human beings whose life is a life of hardship, a life where they suffer from the language that we use and the abuse that we hand out to them as individuals and as governments? There is hope. There's hope that human rights thinking has brought, that there is legislation in place. There's the possibility of sustainable development goals that are going to come in some form or other, which in a sense can enable us to think about the targets of our public policy. There's the whole role of civil society in thinking and holding to account government agencies for delivering on those supposedly consensual goals of eradicating poverty. There's another argument too, that poverty is not just a cost. It's not just that we have to pay other people's benefits, but it's costly in itself in terms of eroding human capital. Just think of all those people who are poor and how much they could contribute to demand if they weren't quite as poor as they are. You as a rich person save. A person in poverty spends. Spending is what generates economic growth. Believe it or not, economic growth may be a good or may be a bad thing, but to be in poverty is to restrict economic growth. And finally, our work is beginning to suggest that policies that are shame-free, that are dignity-enhancing, are likely to be more effective because they promote a sense of confidence and promote human agency. So there's hope. It's the hope that keeps me going and others going. But there are reasons for despair. David was pushing me on the reasons for despair. They are there. History. I indicated earlier that poverty was first defined as a policy problem about 4,000 years ago. It still exists on an enormous scale. Most profoundly of all is that notion that there's no such thing as luck, only opportunity created through hard work. The work ethic, the way we justify our affluence and condemn those who aren't as affluent. And finally, there's the problem of democracy. The problem of democracy is the fact that the majority of us are not poor. We will vote for our own self-interests, not for the minority who are suffering at our expense. Thank you.
I'm curious about social entrepreneurism and whether you find hope there, and secondly, whether you have a sense that dignity is a missing factor.
I'm really suggesting that people experience shame and shame is imposed upon them. It's not clear what the antonym to shame is, but dignity is a pretty good one. And the whole of my reading, my selective reading of human rights is the notion of promoting dignity. And so in a sense, my solution to the problems that we have is to reflect on policy through the lens of promoting dignity. And the empirical work suggests that that may well be more effective at promoting people's interests. The notion of social entrepreneurship, I don't see anything wrong in social entrepreneurship. I come from a tradition of Europe which believes that citizenship is the root of social provision, that we don't need to make a profit out of it, and we don't need to build careers out of it. But we do. I've made a career out of studying poverty. If social entrepreneurship can be combined with a concept of human dignity, that it can be eradicated from its charitable notions, that essentially providing money for you is something that I'm doing out of the kindness of my heart, it strikes me that that is sensible. It seems that the challenge of grappling with 1.4 billion people, 5 million people in the United States are on $125 a day, where the United States has the largest number of people in relative poverty of any OECD country. We need everybody to be thinking about providing and responding to this scar on our society, this shame on us all.
I've heard of this distinction that's made between immediate rights and what philosophers call teleological rights, what politicians call sustainable development goals. The idea is the same, that some rights require time, and that sometimes there's a timetable you need to place on certain rights, like healthcare, and I think poverty would be one of those. You can't just immediately enforce a right to poverty. You need to promote a timetable. But there's like a chain of problems that I think seem to come from that. One is that many countries can't meet this timetable. And that leads to a second problem, which is that there's a lack of accountability in the international community for them, since they lack the structure. You can't compare the United States to a third world country in terms of their ability to provide for this white welfare system. And as such, there's a decreased accountability. And then it raises the question, to what extent is it legitimate for other countries to come in and try to promote and kind of fill that void, which is a huge debate over sovereignty and over the international rights. Where is the nexus between sovereignty and individual human rights? How do you think...
That's 3 questions. How many more are we going?
My essentially the broad question is how do you address these problems? How do you see policies in the international community addressing these problems, specifically with the third, which is really just a culmination of the previous 2?
With difficulty. But equally, there's no point in not trying. We haven't tried. The timeline, as already indicated, is 4,000 years. That's a fair amount of time to wait. Most poor people don't live for 4,000 years. The notion that it's not possible to deliver now is pretty substantially refuted by the work that the ILO has done, which suggests that it is possible within existing budgets in a large majority of developing countries to put in place a social protection floor. The notion of accountability, whether you can compare the United States with a developing country, is a really interesting question. A European would argue that the United States has a great deal to learn from most developing countries in terms of the levels of provision and the way that it's delivered. That's a cynical European view, and we like bashing the Americans. Indeed, we define, as I said at lunchtime, we define the social model of Europe as being everything that America doesn't do. So we believe, for example, that capitalism is facilitated by the provision of social welfare, not that social welfare is what's left over after you've serviced the economy. And it is, therefore, I agree with the notion of accountability or lack of accountability. There's back to it's back to constructing international global governance in some way or other. And the UN is a mess, but it's all we've got. It's got massive democratic deficits. It's ruled by the United States when it can be bothered with the United Nations. Mostly it can't. But essentially it's the vehicle that we have. The accountability, it seems to me at the moment, is supplied by civil society, and it's interesting in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals that a deliberate process of engagement has taken place. It's really interesting ultimately to see what states do with the advice that they've got from civil society, and it may well be disappointing when the goals are finally agreed. But on the other hand, it has engaged civil society, that they are now interested in the possibility. And as we move forward through the 15 years that will follow the Sustainable Development Goals, I'm pretty convinced that civil society will try to hold states accountable. Indeed, I know they were, and I'm involved in a civil society that's trying to do that. Whether other countries should be involved or not is a really interesting notion. It prioritises a notion of national sovereignty You will recall nation states aren't that old. National politicians love the notion of sovereignty, and they don't like Canadians getting involved in US policy. God! It might be better, after all, if they did, and that would be a disaster. So, yes, politicians don't like intervention, but equally, we get it. We've been doing it to the developing world for a long time, largely through the World Bank, which I seem to think is largely funded by the United States and is certainly, in terms of the way it thinks, much influenced by economists who were trained in American universities. So we do it. We do it to them. Why not start thinking about doing it to us too? And if you look at the European Union, you will find that 27 or whatever number of countries it is now are trying collectively to learn from each other. Europe's a mess, no one would deny it. But on the other hand, again, it's an experiment in cross-national governance. And there's processes in place, the open method of coordination, for example, which is a system which is actually using other countries to put pressure on individual countries to move in the direction of commonly shared goals. We have commonly shared goals that I've been describing. How far politicians are yet signed up to them in any real sense is a profoundly important question. But civil society can begin to try and make them.
So the example that you discussed, one of the examples you discussed in the process behind these policies, particularly the Indian example, stood out to me. And you discussed how there's sort of eagerness and there's this struggle to sort of be included as a member of the BPL list. And that stood out to me because then there didn't seem to be this necessary condition, this association between shame and poverty there, because of the benefits that you could reap out of being included. Yeah. And I was wondering if you found any correlation of one of the possible explanations for that being the other sites of your identity that could be the site of where shame is deposited, for instance, caste or skin color or ethnicity in other communities. So I'm wondering if there was a lack of shame in being poor because of these other facets of your identity that you found of these.
India is very complex. It has a caste structure which is based on shame. There are ways of thinking about shame as positive. Indeed, some sociologists divide countries according to whether they're guilt-based societies or shame-based societies, and that's an important distinction. The trouble that I have is that Western social psychology demonstrates that shame is negative. It's negative in its consequences. It doesn't achieve the positive social inclusion goals that shame was originally conceptualized as doing, and probably grew in primate communities as being ways of holding community together in structures which were based on physical power. The empirical evidence is against that, and work that's been done in so-called shame-based societies confirms that. In the context of poverty, it's very difficult to change behaviour, and behaviour isn't the cause of poverty in many cases. In relation to your particular question, there was a certain degree of pride in getting on this list because it meant you had influence. There was no doubt about that. But equally, corruption, bribery is problematic within an Indian culture too. And so in a sense you would incur in that notion. I'm not suggesting that all shame is attributed to poverty. And we all feel ashamed on certain circumstances. Most of the shame we experience, you don't experience on a daily basis every time you see your child and you realise that you can't provide for that child, which is essentially a shame associated with poverty. But we nevertheless feel it. We feel it about identity, about her appearance and all sorts of other things. And they intersect profoundly. So gender in an Indian context is really important in terms of shaping how poverty-related shame is experienced.
Thank you. I'm wondering whether in your research you found poor people themselves butting up against the external imposition of shame, whether there was an internal reclamation of the stigma that you talk about. In Marxist parlance, maybe a class consciousness, but in regular parlance, just a sense of identity with being poor.
The simple answer is no. If you read the literature, if you read the sort of creative literature, the novels, the films, there are stories of people discovering their dignity, coming together and fighting There's also some experience in China where the word humiliation associated with caste has been turned into a positive in the way that black was in the context of civil rights. But there is much more resignation. There is much more a sense of powerlessness. And there's much more a process of division. What we found was that people not only feel personal shame in terms of the inability to respond positively to the child who's demanding, but also the notion that people are being told time and time again that all poor people, well, let's just check, poor people is a problem, poor person is a problem. It implies a person is poor as a person. They're not, they lack income. And words are really difficult in this case. And I think we need to think more consciously about how we talk about people experiencing poverty in some way. But what they're told on a daily basis is the reason that they're poor is that they're lazy and feckless. Well, they know they're not. They struggle day after day. They've got 3 jobs to assemble an income sufficient to survive. So what do they think? They think, well, society can't be wrong, all these people can't be wrong. It must be other people experiencing poverty who are lazy, who are abusing the system. It's not I. And so we have a process of othering that divides one person in poverty from another, that prevents that cohesion, that sense, that celebration, that coming together. The sort of thing that the trade union movements in Europe succeeded in doing doesn't seem to be around in our case studies at the moment. Individual poverty is experienced as individual shame.
As you mentioned in your presentation, the US public doesn't really agree or care about messages that you're bringing here. In Dr. Forstad's class, we talked about how former North Carolina Governor Terry Sanford was able to make poverty an issue concerning the whole public, or a lot of the public, and not just the poor. In your research or in your experience, have you found rhetoric in other places that was able to make poverty an issue concerning all of us and not just the poor?
Norway in the end of the 1990s, the beginning of the 2000s, somehow succeeded. It's a small, comparatively homogenous community, not the divisive political rhetoric that you find in the States, where the right and the left seem to be running fast in opposite directions. And in that context, a politician with charisma introduced the concept of poverty to the second richest country in the world, and they put in place policies which were intended to address these sorts of issues. So it is possible. It is an incredible challenge. Those figures about people blaming people in poverty for laziness resolves of any responsibility to do anything about it. And so we have to rely on those people who care and the role of civil society. There's a sense in which covert policy making through human rights legislation, civil society using that might begin to address the issue that you raise. The way that we got the recommendation for the social protection floor through was twofold. It was to appeal on the grounds of human rights to those governments who buy into the concept of human rights, and the notion of policy effectiveness, getting more for your tax take, in terms of the notion of dignity and enhancing policies. That's what we used to get it through at that global level. Whether mainstream politicians in the US were watching, I very much doubt, because it was happening, over there. But it is a challenge. I think we have to pray for those of us who want to be, those of us who are not content. So the significant numbers of people in the United States who are living in poverty, and the fact that a country as rich as yours should perform so badly in comparison to all other developed countries is something which I find incomprehensible. But we need political leadership. I've talked in other venues while I've been here about the success we've had around civil rights. Okay, you've still got a race-riven society, but nevertheless the situation now is considerably better than it was 40 years ago. Think about sexuality, think about the concept of gay marriage. It is possible to bring about profound social change. The challenge, as I've already also indicated, is that those movements were led by members of the members of the African American community and gay rights who had already made it financially, already had political influence as a result of their spend. And the problem with poverty is that, by definition, people who are poor are powerless, which goes back in a way to Father Joseph, although I critiqued his analysis of the problem, the notion that people who are in extreme poverty need others to understand and to work with them to advocate their case and their cause.
So you spoke a little bit about the role of the media in creating stigmas and shame towards people in poverty.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me in your presentation was that in the brief study that you did of the United States, you studied urban populations, that is, you looked at poverty in New York. And an interesting statistic is that actually, and I believe you were probably looking at mostly like people of color, and when we look in the media in the United States, when you say look at someone on welfare, most people would imagine it's either like a black or Hispanic family on welfare, but ultimately, like if you look at the statistics, it's only 10% of people on welfare are urban blacks,
I think
for
it's
example.
considerably more than 10% because it's disproportionate people of colour who are on welfare. But you're absolutely right, the majority of people
Right, that are specifically
welfare.
urban and black,
Yeah.
which is like the one group that would be that the media shows the most.
Okay.
And so I was wondering, like in your methodology for the 7 countries that you studied extensively, how do you balance like the images that people typically get of poverty with making sure that you're getting like a very extensive view, balancing rural and urban poverty, for example, and making sure that you're not only looking at one type of poverty?
This, if you like, is an exploratory study. There's no way that we can resolve all of those sorts of issues. The stories we're telling are generalised. They're based on very small numbers, but spending a lot of time with people, listening and working with them and engaging. Your question is profound. We looked at very different settings, which was an attempt in a way to address that, but we were addressing it at an international scale rather than, in a sense, addressing it in terms of the domestic world. You're profoundly right. Issues of race, welfare and poverty are so intertwined in the American psychic as well as in American society and politics that it's really important to pull them apart. A very fascinating group discussion that I have recently been transcribing and beginning to analyse, which was a group of African American professionals who we were engaging with in thinking about these issues. And their analysis of poverty was determined exclusively by discrimination and racism. That was the way they interpreted and understood poverty in a US context. The notion that Caucasians could be poor was not part of their thinking. I found that fascinating. I wasn't involved in the group, and there were lots of questions that I would have liked to have pushed them to get them to, well, simply to address the question, if poverty is caused purely by the racial divides within our society, how can a person who is Caucasian be poor? Would have been an interesting thing to reflect. But the extent to which poverty intersects with race is staggering to a European. And, you know, issues of identity, issues of the core, the nature of shame, the extent to which it's attributable to race or which it's attributable to poverty itself are challenging issues. The story that we're telling is a pretty simple story. It's a story that says that poverty is not just about lack of income, it has consequences beyond that. That poverty hurts not just because you can't buy things, but because you can't do things, you can't care, you can't be a full citizen in your society. And the other thing that it points to is that this isn't an individual thing. We can't just blame people in poverty for feeling shame. You and I and our institutions that we elect and govern seem to be compounding that shame. That's sometimes inadvertent. It's sometimes deliberate. Our evidence suggests that it's probably what affluent people want. But it also suggests that it's not very effective as a public policy.
Please join me in thanking
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.